We are going to start a new chapter in financial management, that is capital budgeting. This is an important chapter for finance subject in courses like BCom, MCom, BBA, MBA, CA, Actuarial Science, etc. This topic is a part of syllabus for some BTech courses also. So this topic or this chapter is very important. We will cover all the topics in this chapter that is related to capital budgeting. In this video, we are going to introduce what is capital budgeting and what is the importance of capital budgeting. This capital budgeting is also called investment decision. This we already studied in one of our previous video. We know every company has to choose where it should invest. If this investment decision is for long term, then it is called capital budgeting. So, capital budgeting deals with a long term investment. So, the decision is to be taken where to invest for a long term. So, a company has to decide where it should invest for long term. This decision is required to take at the beginning or in between the operation of a business. So, we are going to define what is capital budgeting. The definition of capital budgeting is that it is the process of evaluating and selecting long-term investments. So, capital budgeting is the process of evaluating and selecting long-term investments. What do you mean by long-term investment? Long-term investment means that it is for more than 1 year. So, in capital budgeting, the investment is made initially in expectation of a future benefit. So, it is having initial expenditure, but we are expecting a future revenue less running cost. So, the main characteristics of capital budgeting is that it is for long term, that is more than 1 year. And the second is that it requires an initial investment or an initial expenditure in expectation of a future cash inflow or a revenue. So, we defined capital budgeting. Now, can you say an example of such an investment? One example we can say is construction of a factory. We know construction of a factory requires an initial expenditure, but we are expecting a cash inflow or a revenue from it in future, less the running cost or the operational cost. So, this type of investment is called capital budgeting. Another example is purchase of fixed asset, like land, building, etc. The capital budgeting is very important for all business. We are going to study the importance of capital budgeting. So, we studied what is capital budgeting. One of the characteristics we studied there is that it is a long-term investment. That is, the decision is taken for a long period of time. So, the effect of decision will stay for long period of time. So, this is very important for a company or an organization because it determines the future of that organization. So, this decision determines the future. If the decision is correctly taken, then we can say it will make the company grow in future. But if the decision is wrong, then in future it may lead to the failure of company and its operation. So, the capital budgeting is important because it is for long period of time. That is, it determines the future of an organization. Second, we know it requires an initial expenditure, and this expenditure involves a large amount of fund. So, the company has to make an initial expenditure. That is, now it has to spend a large amount of fund in an expectation of future revenue. In normal cases, the fund required for capital budgeting decision exceeds normal budget of an organization. So the decision will affect financial ability of a company. Since it involves large amount of funds, a wrong decision can cause huge loss to the company. So the decision is very important. We also know that the capital, that is the fund available, is always a limited resource. So it is also important to check whether a project is economically acceptable or not, or whether this large amount of fund is invested correctly. So, there is an importance for capital budgeting as it involves large amount of fund. Third reason for the importance of capital budgeting is that the irreversibility of decision. Most of the capital budgeting decisions are irreversible in nature. That is, once it is implemented, firms cannot change it to previous situation. We know in many cases, like construction of a factory, it is impossible to reverse it back to the previous situation. So, the capital budgeting decision is very important as it helps to identify correct proposal of project from a pool of projects or investment opportunities. Fourth point, or the reason for importance of capital budgeting, is that it requires an appropriate time. Many capital budgeting decisions take years to implement. So planning and budgeting is necessary for these investments. So capital budgeting is important. We know the timing of the investments are also much important. Capital budgeting will help to identify the possibilities and to plan and budget it correctly. Fifth and last point we are going to discuss here is that it involves future events. We already studied this type of investments are involving some future events. That is, the decision should be taken that involves future events. We know future is always having some uncertainties. So, it is a complex decision. Therefore, it requires proper study, planning and calculation to take these decisions. So, there comes the importance of capital budgeting decisions because it involves the future events. So, in this video, we studied what is capital budgeting decision and why it is important for an organization. We will study more about capital budgeting, its process, techniques and numericals in coming videos. Stay tuned with us. Keep learning.